My name is John Kalberg. I'm an assistant professor over at the United States Military Academy at West Point and a member of Army Cyber Institute. This panel's topics are ethics and confusion in cyberspace, which I find pretty timely right now. It's big topics, and we're going to discuss norms and also different forms of ethics around cyberspace. But we will also open up for discussion, which I think might be a good way of ushering this forward. And the presenters today are Alfonso Di Giorgio from Italy. Correct. Who is focused on the intersection between software security and security software and seeking to the undisclosed, the unknown. Dan Geer said that cybersecurity research is to seek the unknown. So that's the track Alfonso's on. Brian De Messinek is at George Mason University, and he will present together with Patricia Shamai from University of Portsmouth. So I let you start off, Alfonso. You feel free.
Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, dear friends and colleagues, good morning. Thanks for the invitation. Thanks again for the kind introduction. To start, a short story. I was 10 when I was given a West Point Military Academy baseball cap. I was so impressed by the embroidered logo that I was wearing that cap every single day of my life. Soon the plastic snap closing broke, so I fixed it with some tape before returning to my fashionable obsession, because Italians are crazy about fashion, right? The point is that fast forward almost half dozen lustra, I still jealously have that cap with me. All of which is to say that it's a great honor and a privilege to be here with you in Washington, D.C. for the inaugural CyCon US conference that has the NATO, CCD-COE, and the Cyber Army Institute at West Point Military Academy among the co-organizers. So, zero-day vulnerabilities, weaknesses in software or hardware unknown to the parties who can mitigate their specific negative effects, are gaining a prominent role in modern-day intelligence, national security, and law enforcement operation. At the same time, the lack of transparency and accountability in their trade and acquisition, the risk of overexploitation and abuse, the latter to conflict of interest by the parties handling them, and their potential double effects may pose societal risks and may lead to the breach of human rights. If left unaddressed, these usage-related challenges call into question the legitimacy of zero-day vulnerabilities as enablers of law enforcement and national security operation, and erode the benefits that their proportionate use have for the judiciary, defense, and intelligence purposes. So, with your help, what I want to do today is to briefly review the vulnerability supply chain, its main actors, and the surrounding ethical questions. After setting the stage, I will share with you how I decided to address those questions in my occupation. In doing so, it's not my intention neither to lecture anybody about how you are expected to behave, nor to provide a definitive answer to pressing challenges. I will be happy if I will have asked more questions than give an answer, or if I will have provided some principles and standards to build upon. So let's get started. As already mentioned, zero-day vulnerabilities are enablers of today's cybersecurity strategies. A supply chain emerged in order to answer the needs of these particular demanders. To begin with, due to economic, regulatory, and legal incentives that are misaligned, stopped, or ineffectual, software makers introduced an unknown number of vulnerabilities during the product development life cycle. In our society that is growing more interconnected and interdependent, vulnerabilities are like pollutants. Was private cost is almost zero to the polluters, but was social cost is almost unbearable for the society. All of which is to say that poorly written, insecure software, the cost of poorly written, insecure software is almost zero to software makers that as a result are practicing unrestrained vulnerability dumping onto the downstream market participants. In absence of a policy discouraging the unrestrained vulnerability dumping onto the downstream market participants, defenders are too busy mopping the floor in order to turn off the faucet. But software has among the highest level defects of any products sold today, so we need to patch it. Yet patching plays as a perverse incentive, allowing software manufacturers to renegotiate contract terms the user could not negotiate in the first place. So this is how every time a new vulnerability comes out, we find ourselves signing a new license agreement. But this license agreement gives to the software maker the ability to renegotiate contract terms the user could not negotiate in the first place, and from which the user has no satisfactory way out. Vulnerability hunters find in the aftermarket defects the software maker failed to detect themselves. And high-performance organization, both in the industry and in the government sector, demand the findings of this research in order to enable their security strategies. Various types of marketplaces compete with each other in order to win the preferences of vulnerability hunters towards their specific idea of which security strategies are worthwhile implementing. The reality is that vulnerabilities are the unknown currency of the security aftermarket. But it's my contention that wherever we turn our attention in the vulnerability supply chain, from software makers to vulnerability hunters to government agency, each and every industry actor of the vulnerability supply chain face their corresponding ethical issues related to the knowledge of zero-day vulnerabilities. So I want to ask you, who holds the moral low ground? The ruthless malefactors profiting from yet another remote code execution vulnerability, or vendors practicing unrestrained vulnerability dumping onto the downstream market participants? Who are the ones that exploit us the most? The forensic security services taking control of our mobile assets, or vendors using patching to renegotiate contract terms the user could not negotiate in the first place, and from which the user had no satisfactory way to escape. If our governments introduce strict controls in order to administer the scope of intrusion software, should we demand software manufacturers to internalize the cost of insecure software that we import into our lives for reason of symmetry? Should we make them liable for the defects and flaws that allowed intrusion in the first place? With incomplete knowledge about the real-world security of systems we entrust our business, is it even ethical to refrain us from hunting vulnerabilities or prevent others from doing that likewise? And what should do a security researcher with a vulnerability when it gets found? Is full disclosure an acceptable course of action? Does full disclosure becomes more acceptable if the affected vendor ignores the vulnerability that were reported responsibly or fails to provide a timely patch? Does coordinated vulnerability disclosure provide a more ethically sound path to be taken? And does the same path remain morally preferable if one of the parties who received the vulnerability information from the coordinator prior to its public disclosure use this vulnerability information to exploit vulnerable entities? Are bounty programs exploiting bounty hunters if they pay only a fraction of the real market value for the same vulnerability research? Should bounty hunters pretend to get paid if they were not invited to perform their work? And what government security agencies should do with vulnerabilities? Should they exploit them, or should they let everybody else mitigate them in the way they already do? Should they take advantage of those vulnerabilities to benefit a limited number of stakeholders, or should they disclose them to all affected constituents? As the power inequity in the vulnerability equation to be balanced, with entities affected by vulnerabilities spread all around the world, how to inform the public, with vendors threatening legal action supported by the significant financial resources, how to protect the security researchers, with our society growing more data intensive, how to oversee not only material technology but also knowledge, How do they attempt to strike a balance between scientific openness, national security, or define the science-security relation? How does scientific knowledge become subject to security governance? And how does this dynamic affect the links among scientific knowledge, security expertise, and political decision? And finally, can we regard hacking to be an ethical practice and condemn at the same time the trade of capabilities enabling this practice as immoral? Today, what I want to do with you is to explore what the private sector involved in the acquisitions or the vulnerabilities can do in order to respect human rights and the benign and societally beneficial use of these capabilities. Zero-day vulnerabilities are not ipso facto beneficial or harmful. They can be used for beneficial purposes or misused for harmful aims. As such, they are dual-use knowledge, dual-purpose knowledge, that can enable dual-use technology. Yet, in the context of computer network operation, what makes any given capability good or bad is very much a matter of perspective. Depending on which side of the playing field we look at things, the same capability may be regarded differently if it goes towards the creation or the detriment of political, military, diplomatic, business, financial advantage. Notwithstanding the uneven regulatory field, the public international law and treaties should be followed by the private sector in the acquisition of zero-day vulnerabilities. To begin with, the private sector should ensure to not enable with its tools the cybersecurity strategies of entities willing to abuse human rights. Also, the private sector will need to contribute towards the realization of the right to health by controlling which capability they provide to whom, if those capabilities may pose a direct danger to the health of human beings. Of course, they will need to honor the highest integrity standards, avoiding possible conflict of interest, and respect the confidentiality of both business partners and the capabilities they trade. So, what I want to do with my code of business ethics is to address these usage-related challenges and contribute towards the realization of a greater culture of responsibility. So I established 6 principles and 8 corresponding ethical standards. The principles are aspirational goals aimed at guiding and inspiring the conduct of the business, and they underpin the ethical standards. The ethical standards are enforceable rules for the day-to-day business operation. Let's give them a quick look. The first and foremost governing principle that today I offer to the private sector is the clean hands principle, which asks the private sector and me to respect all human rights proclaimed by international human rights treaties, including the International Bill of Human Rights, and strive to ensure no complicity whatsoever in any human rights abuses. Therefore, I vet and monitor my customer by not engaging in any business activities with entities known for abusing human rights, reserving the right to cease or suspend business operation with entities found to be involved with human rights abuses at a later point in time. Principle B builds on first, it's about not posing danger to human health, to champion human health. Therefore, there are capabilities that are not admissible. The private sector should not engage in any trade of capabilities that exploit vulnerabilities in medical devices or systems to which human life is entrusted, unless the vendor or the affected device or system is the acquiring entity, or the acquiring entity has been authorized by the vendor to be the recipient of the vulnerability disclosure process. Similarly, I don't want the private sector to ever trade stolen trade secrets and require the suppliers to have independently discover and autonomously develop their related technology. I don't want my suppliers to be employee of the affected software vendors. I don't want my suppliers to have received confidential information by disclosure or the same, which is to say that I don't want the software maker employee to write himself a new event tonight, right? Of course, it will be very important to avoid possible conflict of interest related to the overexploitation of the capabilities and the unintended use, to obey the law, in particular laws related to trade controls, and preserve the confidentiality that needs to be understood as both the confidentiality of business partners and the vulnerability information itself. But at the end of the day, we need a fallback principle. We need a default policy in order to enable our business. And this default policy is contributed by the doctrine of double effect. Essentially here, I acknowledge that the capabilities I provide in the fulfillment of my service may be used within goods that, just like any, all cybersecurity tools are inherently dual purpose and potentially dual use. The military use of those capabilities may have a double effect, an intended effect and a foreseen but genuinely unintended consequences. So while I advise against the harmful side effects of certain capabilities, I accept to trade them unless they are not in conflict with the other principles and standards set forth in the present Code of Ethics. And that's pretty much it. So, concluding, today I'm honored to be with you in Washington, D.C. I'm reminded about Alisa Zinoyevna Rosenbaum, who once remarked, every aspect of the Western culture needs a new code of ethics. A rational ethics as a precondition of rebirth. I feel similarly when it comes to the debate surrounding vulnerabilities. Every aspect of the vulnerability supply chain needs a new code of ethics, a rational ethics as a precondition of rebirth. In this spirit, today I offer the principles and standards of my code of ethics to your comments and criticism. If, as noted by Herb Warren, in A Civilized Life, law floats on the sea of ethics, it's both my hope and wish that our today reflection will inform policymakers. As recently noted by Stephen Aftergood on Nature, expanding the scope of ethical deliberation over new technology may seem like a daunting prospect bound to impede innovation. Sure enough, today I ask questions more quickly than can be possibly answered. But experience suggests that many such questions will be dwarf asking. I welcome all your thoughts. Thank you.
Thank you. So, I would like to then move on with Brian and Patricia's presentations, and then I have a larger question and answer session afterwards, which we also, can digest your thoughts and cover the pretty wide spectrum of this session. You can either sit down or be by the podium.
I'll sit, but do I need to put our slides up?
No, they will do it all day.
Have you got these?
You can make some on the podium.
Yeah, is my microphone?
That's on.
Okay. Just wait for us to be put up. Well, while we're waiting for those, if I just introduce myself and just sort of explain a little bit about where we're coming from with this. I'm an academic based at Portsmouth University in the UK, and my specialty interests relate to defence and security, and primarily WMD. So cyber is a slightly new area for me. And my research is focused on the norms, the attitudes towards specific methods of warfare. And Brian and I have been in contact throughout, for a long time actually, throughout our PhD studies. Brian, do you want to say a little bit?
Sure. So, and I've explored some similar threads in terms of the WMD analogy, applying it to cyber and potential emergence of normative constraints that could be a policy tool to deal with at least an aspect of this threat, making it a more catastrophic side of the spectrum. And I think that's what we're about to talk about.
So the two of us have been in contact because we were both interested in looking at the collective attitudes towards specific methods of warfare. And so this piece of research that we've been doing is based on a collaboration from our individual research interests. We saw that there was some linkage, and sort of we pulled that together into this presentation and into the paper. So this is the first time that we've run through it, but it's very nice to have an opportunity to talk about it. Oops. Okay. So if we start with our agenda, I always have a slide with an agenda because I just think it's a nice way of sort of kicking things off and explaining what we're going to do. And the presentation is really in two parts. So what we want to do is we want to sort of outline for you our main argument, where we're coming from, and then talk a little bit about the normative debate. But what do we mean by this term norms? How do we gain some kind of understanding of what collective attitudes are, what ideas, understandings and beliefs are associated with specific methods of warfare? How are they formed? So there's a little bit of a sort of theoretical discussion about norms, which I will keep very limited because I'm aware that my audience is not primarily academic, and it's early in the morning on a Sunday, so too much talk about theory will make you all fall asleep. But it's necessary in order to sort of frame the discussion a little bit. And then I'm going to go and talk about, if I start from my discussion on this notion of stigma. So my research looked at the categorization of WMD, chemical, biological, and nuclear weapons. And I deliberately used the term WMD rather than CBRN or anything else, because I'm looking at the political significance of that term and sort of what's recognized by the general public, what's a commonly accepted term. So I came up with this idea of stigma, which basically, and we'll go into more depth on it in a moment, but it's basically talking about this singling out, this labeling of a specific method of warfare as distinct, a specific category of warfare as distinct. And then from that research, Brian and I started to talk about how that is, and this research is primarily historical, how the historical findings into stigma can be applied to cyber, and if there could ever be a stigma towards cyber, and how can we encourage a stigma in order to address the cyber threat. So we're presenting in two parts. I'll cover the first half, which talks about this idea of norms and builds up to a discussion about stigmatization and about this general process of singling out specific category of warfare, specific types of weapons as distinct. And then we move on to looking at the cyber debate and then what we can do with that. And we finish with some recommendations about what we think we could do for the future. So when we were talking about this, when we were talking about, okay, how do we look at this? How do we start? We started to form some questions. And we started to sort of say, okay, well, what is it that we're trying to address? Where do we come from? And we start by saying, okay, well, how do international norms emerge? How does this process begin? Is it just some magical process that takes place suddenly, or how does it evolve through time? And where is the evidence to demonstrate that there's an international recognition that a specific method of warfare can cause disproportionate harm, can be seen, because all weapons cause harm, can be seen as distinct? So we start to look at the norms associated, how do they evolve, what role does stigma play in the development of international norms? So why does stigma matter? How does stigmatization occur, and what are the prospects for stigmatizing cyber warfare? So once we've got this idea that yes, there are certain weapons that stand out as distinct, that are labeled as distinct, what can we then do? How can we apply that to the cyber argument? And that's really the big question. That's really where we're coming from. So what's our argument? And again, we were talking about this slide, where to put this in the presentation, and I always think it's a good idea, Brian was great, to put the slide with your argument at the beginning, okay? Because that tells you where we're coming from. So essentially, what are we saying? We're saying that in order to get some kind of international action against a specific method of warfare, in order to address a weapons threat, it requires action from powerful states. Okay, it requires some form of leadership, and that leadership will only occur if there seems to be a national interest in doing something about that weapon. If it's not in the national interest, then action won't be taken. And an example of that can be seen with chemical warfare prior to the First World War. That new type of weapon, that new weapons technology, was considered actually to possibly be advantageous. And so therefore, it was seen that it wasn't in the interests of the United States, of the United Kingdom, and those two states primarily, to actually do anything about those weapons, because those weapons were a hypothetical threat. After the First World War, everything changed. But an example that backs up one of our arguments. Our second point is that an international stigma associated with weapons is a variable that is based on perceptions of self-interest. So again, and I'll go into more depth, stigma is formed by, it's a socially constructed norm, and I'll go into more depth in a moment. These are the two sort of main points. The cyber threat is diffuse, it's secretive, and it's complicated. And because of that, it's difficult to define, it's difficult to sort of address. And it's distinct from the WMD threat, because the WMD threat, again, we'll go into a little bit more depth, but if you take the nuclear example, it's way out there. You know, if nuclear weapons being used, or if there's potential for a nuclear weapon to be used, it's out there, you can see it. And this is the main problem. The cyber threat is diffuse, and at present there's no stigma towards cyber warfare, and the emergence of such a stigma faces numerous challenges, and that's because of the point above. So that's essentially our argument, which I'm going to hopefully unravel in a little bit more detail, and Brian will as well. So we start by looking at norms, and I promise I will keep this brief. When we're talking about a norm, the first thing we need to do is understand what we mean by this term. Okay? And the best way to address it is to think of norms as a standard of appropriate behavior for actors with a given identity. Okay? So essentially, they're standards of behavior, they're standards they're based on some form of moral basis, standards of identity, what's seen as right, as wrong, what is accepted behavior. And norms I had a very good friend who's a scientist, and we were at a conference a long time ago, and we were meeting for dinner, and he was saying, what is this talk about norms? What does it mean? And I said to him, the two things that you always need to remember, and I say this to my students, norms are standards of behavior, and they are socially constructed. They're formed by the standards within society. Okay, they are our social standards, and therefore they're constructed over time, and they're subject to change. They are not set principles that can never be changed. They are shaped over time by the actions of society, by the environment in which people are living. And there are several sort of important functions of norms. Norms can be regulatory, so they can regulate behavior, they can form the laws in society, they can create new categories of action. And then finally, you can have certain norms that stand out as being globally distinct. So these are standards of behavior that the international community has accepted. And these would be norms such as prostitution, slavery, drug trafficking. Okay, norms which through time have stood out as over and above the standards of behavior of any other practice. Okay? And so this is important when we're looking at the norms associated with specific methods of warfare. Okay? What is it about those weapons, about those methods of warfare, that stand the test of time, that make them globally distinct? And one of the arguments for global prohibition norms is that these norms affect our moral standards. Okay, they're predicated generally on Western democratic norms, but they affect our understanding of what's right and wrong. And they emerge through, and I'm going to keep this brief because I'm aware of the time, they emerge from a domestic level up to an international level. So they start by having normally a norm entrepreneur. So this is a group, this could be an advocacy group, this could be an individual, that says that a certain practice is wrong. So if you take the slave trade, that practice is wrong. It's morally wrong, it should be changed. And through time it builds momentum. It builds momentum on a domestic level, and it becomes accepted within domestic law. And then over time it becomes internationalized. So it becomes accepted within international law, within the international environment. Now we can use that example when we're looking at specific methods of warfare. Okay, and we can say, well again, there are specific methods of warfare which can be accepted by a state, and then they can be sort of debated within international forums by a number of states, and then they can build momentum. And you see this through history, through different types of warfare. Submarine warfare is an example, chemical weapons is another example. So that hopefully, very briefly, sets the framework for our discussion on stigma. Which is a branding or labeling of a specific, initially it's a sociological concept, specific category, individual, groups of individuals as distinct. These are seen as outsiders. And they're normally branded because of a mark, a disfigurement, something that makes them stand out within society. So when we are looking at that in terms of the individual, the famous academic to work on it is Irving Goffman. He says it's a social label created by a reaction of others. So we take this notion that norms are socially constructed, then we can say that a stigma is socially constructed. Okay? Now, the social construction emerges through groups and individuals within society. Okay? And it's adopted by the leadership of that society. Now, we can transpose the research into stigma from individuals to specific weapons. And we can say that there are certain weapons which stand out as distinct. There's something about them, there's something about the way that they are used or about the effects of their use which make them distinct. And this is where the research into WMD came, because chemical weapons stood out as being distinct, biological weapons, because essentially of the understanding of chemical weapons, biological weapons flowed from that, and then nuclear, because that precedent was set, nuclear followed on from that. So we can say that there is a certain pattern, a certain identification of a stigma process that emerges. And the WMD example is taken from that. Initially it's from the chemical, then the biological, then the nuclear. And what came from it really was this fundamental understanding that you cannot protect against the use of these weapons. So chemical weapons, they're unseen, and if used, their effects have long-term consequences. The same with biological, the same with nuclear. Within certain contexts, there's an element of protection. However, as a long-term issue, it was recognized back historically that there was very little that you could do about them. And that's what set the stigma towards WMD. That's what set these weapons as distinct. And this slide sort of confirms that based on Western democratic states' perceptions of these weapons, they're a social construction, they're a reactive process. So these conceptual understandings about these weapons can change over time. If there is another weapon that has even more destructive effect, or has a more unseen or a more prohibitive nature, then that weapon can overtake the WMD stigma. Okay, it's not confined, it's not set in time, it's a reactive process. And it's significantly formed around the language and the image of these weapons. In time, the language and the image towards nuclear weapons has developed. In time, it could change with a different form of warfare. Okay, I realise I'm probably going over time, so I'll quickly move on.
Okay, thank you. So I'll just kind of take it from where Patricia set it up and apply it a little bit to cyber and do so briefly, and then we can get hopefully to your questions and discussions. But pivoting to cyber a bit and backing up, I think it's worth briefly reflecting on the state of norms for cyber generally, and then we'll talk about stigma. And again, norms are shared expectations of appropriate behavior. And one of the key hypotheses of norm evolution theory in that norm life cycle that was up a moment ago is that when you've got more actors, entrepreneurs, leaders, organizational platforms in the international arena talking about norms, that will lead more quickly to a norm emergence and eventually cascade. So what do we have right now with cyber? We have a lot of that. We have, as Alfonso talked about, there's a lot of discussion about ethics for vulnerability disclosure and things like that. There's the Talon Manual, the NATO COE, lots of discussions within that alliance construct. There's the group of government experts at the United Nations that spent a lot of time talking about ethics and norms for cyber behavior. There's bilateral and multilateral discussions. One of the key ones, and there's the picture there of President Obama in September of last year when there was the agreement between the Chinese and the US government on prohibiting commercial cyber espionage, and that was then expanded to the G20 and others. So there's a lot of discussion about norms. So how are we actually doing? Well, when we look at norms for cyber warfare specifically, and we're talking there about really computer network attack, things that would be more akin to other types of really warfare, destructive things, similar to WMD and whatnot. The norms have not really emerged despite all of that. That's a conclusion that was put forth in the International Strategy for Cyberspace many years ago now. The Director of National Intelligence, D.N.I. Clapper, in every testimony he's given on the worldwide threats each year over the past 3 years, he has made this point that norms have not kept pace in cyberspace. We, of course, have numerous examples of bad behavior in cyberspace in terms of the Sony attack, Stuxnet, and other things. And the reason that this is the case, we would argue, is because that state determination of self-interest that Patricia mentioned, states have not yet reached that point where there's a critical mass that have concluded that constraining norms are in their interest. And in part, to go back tied into stigma, that's because there's not currently a stigma associated with cyber warfare. Now, why is this? And some of this is simple concepts, but worth really reflecting on in greater detail. There's really, I think, two main reasons why looking at the WMD example as an analogy, why a stigma for cyber warfare hasn't emerged. Remember, again, a stigma is based on use of image, language, or collective perception associated with something. The perception of the cyber threat is really messy. And I put this picture up just to illustrate that. I love this one. It's a fairly old graphic, but it just illustrates what is cyber warfare. You throw that term around and they mean so many different things. It can be computer network exploitation, computer network attack, hacktivism, all kinds of stuff on the spectrum. And that really blurs the collective perception that's so important for stigma. So the language creates a big problem. The second piece is the secrecy associated with cyberspace, the issues of the challenges associated with attribution that we've been talking about here for a few days, make it very hard to demonstrate in the public perception what cyber warfare really is, and associated with that negative image that would be behind it, the foundation really of any stigma. That was, again, as Patricia mentioned, that was the case with WMD before the, particularly chemical weapons, before the First World War. It was the case with strategic air power in the interwar period. There were a lot of debates about what is this, what will the effect be, and it made it very, very difficult for a stigma and ultimately also a constraining norm to emerge. And cyber is very much in that same place. And the one good piece we did want to highlight is that cyber is viewed as special and distinct. So it has that piece which could be a foundation for treating it differently if it could be grafted onto other existing normative constructs, maybe those associated with WMD. So what are our recommendations and conclusions? And these are geared largely towards policymakers. The first is that we don't think policymakers should hold out hope that norms and a stigma will be kind of the silver bullet to deal with this threat. They face really significant challenges, as we just highlighted. But there are some things that can be done, we think, to help at least build towards maybe having a stigma and a constraining norm emerge at a certain point. And that's really, first, increasing the transparency so you can have that kind of demonstration to develop the image in the public and in key leaders that will be necessary. And then also really work on cleaning up the language and stratifying the cyber threats in the public perception so you can really focus on those where stigma might actually take root. And with that, we'll pause for discussion and questions.
Yeah, thank you so much, all three of you. So now we have about 35 minutes to have some mind-blowing questions. Go ahead.
So when we think, well, yeah. So when we are looking at cyber warfare, we kind of jump to this notion of the stigma. But if we take a look and kind of combine the two talks, and we start to think of a zero-day type of market and what we actually might want to be doing, how do you? One of the things that you could have someone do is cause a reboot of a computer. That'd be a pretty standard type thing that you might be able to have an exploit to do. And what if the computer is laser targeting of a tank or something that is going to be doing the drivetrain of some sort of helicopter or something? So how do you think that that exploits that could be? I mean, how would you price exploits that could be used in warfare, and how would you actually see that working at a tactical level?
That's a very tough question to be answered. I'm not even frustrated to have an absolute answer for you. The contribution generally the private sector have for some government agencies in sourcing some capabilities is mostly oriented not to capabilities targeting those kind of equipment and systems, but is largely focused on endpoint communicating devices, because those devices are those available to the vulnerability researcher community at large in order to do research on. So my focus while designing the code of business ethics was aimed towards real use cases, most typical use cases. All other targets are indeed relevant, no doubt that everybody has, but I feel, please correct me if I'm mistaken, that they are actively researched within government labs and not by independent information security researchers spread over the different continents.
So how do we look at the norms for tactical use versus the norms that you were talking about with strategic use? If you look at a nuclear hand grenade, something that would be used that we are not really using right now, we still stigmatize any use of nuclear weapons across the entire spectrum. So how does the possible use at the tactical level influence the discussion of the strategic level of cyber warfare?
I would say on that, I think going back to that norm life cycle, really to get into the weeds on the tactical level, to use your terms, you would need to have really norm internalization, and the broader norm has to emerge at a very general level to eventually get to the point where you can then be codifying it in certain ways in international agreements and things that could potentially apply to these different areas. I do think it's interesting, the idea of vulnerabilities, particularly as they relate to perhaps military capabilities and how that may play out, using the example of biological weapons. That was a key factor in the U.S. determination to disavow its offensive biological weapons program, was the perception of military utility. So it's not exactly answering your question, but I think the question of the military utility of cyber weapons will just definitely relate to how states will perceive it in their interest and how they'll behave in terms of the strategic level of normative response.
I think, yeah, just to back up one, I think if you use the stigma example, it builds momentum over time. The stigma is sort of seen as the most extreme norm. So essentially, I think for the stigma to emerge, for it to emerge, become internalized, for it to take off, it really is dependent on a recognition of the effects of the particular, so tactical, the effects of using a weapon in a tactical manner. What would be the outcome? It's the outcome really, and then it's the perception, the knowledge and the awareness from it. So the language that's used on the publicity, if there's an effect and it's used within a tactical sense and only seen by a limited audience, then that's not necessarily going to fire an international reaction. The stigma is based on the broader public perception as well as the which provokes the international response. If that makes sense. It's a socially constructed norm, so it's going to build over time.
So, Alfonso, you overwhelmed me with a lot of information. I really look forward to reading your paper. I'd like you to follow up on one point. I may have gotten this wrong. My apologies if I, in my haste to take notes, got this wrong. But you mentioned that vulnerabilities are like pollutants. And there's almost no cost to the polluters, but then society is stuck both with dealing with the impacts and with cleaning up the mess. I think society is dealing with the impacts now, but the cleaning up the mess bit is a bit intriguing. Would you propose the international equivalent of an environmental protection agency with a Superfund cleanup to go after cleaning up the mess, fixing the latent vulnerabilities? I mean, what we know about legacy systems is they're the ones that work. If they didn't work, we get rid of them. But they work, so we're stuck with them, and it's costly to replace them. So we are left with this toxic mess of legacy vulnerabilities, pollutants. Do you have any ideas on how to deal with that?
Thanks for the question. If we look back to the history of pollution and how our society decided to respond to it, we can notice that the environment, it was necessary for our society to make the environment part of the beauty contest. After making the environment part of the beauty contest, it was possible to create products and services that were environmentally respectful and to champion good practice also while producing goods at the industry level. Nowadays, in the software security market, and which is to say also the information security market, we are not there. Security is not part of the beauty contest. Due to information asymmetries and network externalities, the consumers cannot tell a good and robust and secure products apart from product that is secure, because essentially the market is driven by the ship and test mantra, or the don't worry, me correctly mantra advocated by entrepreneurs innovating the most, right? So we need really to fix and align the economic incentives into the market in order to make security part of the beauty contest. And then we can experience something, it's my wish, I know, we can experience something as we experienced in the safety market for cars, where car producers were compelled to introduce safety measure into their cars. And a rating scheme emerged in order to provide a signal to consumers about the quality of each given car attempt. We should do our best to contribute towards that direction.
Sticking with you, Alfonso, I think we've heard over a couple panels and from the Federal Trade Commission this morning that the way the U.S. business structure works with executives making decisions, and under U.S. law they're required to take the interests of their shareholders primarily into account. That's their first obligation. And other countries have different ideas of how business capitalism work in with government regulation. But you mentioned that an educated consumer is going to be better and more knowledgeable. What we saw from this morning with the Federal Trade Commission is that oftentimes with claims of security or claims of whatever wonderfulness a product has based on the manufacturer saying it may or may not be accurate. So in adopting a code of ethics for businesses, how would you either pursue incentives for businesses to adopt these, that it is cost effective and worthwhile for them, versus balancing that with a punishment aspect that they have to live up to their their claims of security first, and then if they do lie, how to enforce those norms.
Thanks for the question. I don't believe to have a definite answer to all of this. It's my feeling that we should reconsider software liability. Software products at the highest density of defects within products sold today. Still, we depend and trust our business, our life, to computing devices. There is a cliche that software liability will impede innovation, will slow it down. I don't believe this is the case. This was not the case for the safety market in cars. Of course, all market players will need to figure out how to engineer security into their products. But I'm quite confident that they can catch up, because in academia, we have been researching how to build security into our products. They simply need to internalize the cost of building security. And we need, at the same time, third parties, authorities, providing a signal to the marketplace, to members of the marketplace, in order to make them, in order to inform them and provide them, give them the opportunity to take an informed decision. Of course, claims advanced by producers themselves are meaningless.
So follow up to Bill's question here. So, but a lot of these security issues, we have the technical solution. It's just that there's no incentive to build it in. And then we can have economic drivers, and we can have vocal drivers, like a digital Ralph Nader. The guy set up in the 60s, and suddenly everybody ended up with a seat, to a belt. And how do you see norms developing as we begin with those reasons? How you see them develop? What would be incentives? Do you see any incentives coming? Also, what would be the force to build up this stigma around cyber weapons? Would it be some shocking events, or how do you see it?
I would say, sadly, probably two things. It can come from the media, from the impression and the collective image of cyber warfare. So building a momentum, you sort of saw through the 1980s, really, lots of films, doomsday scenarios about the use of nuclear weapons, about this, this massive nuclear war. So I would say images of the Iran-Iraq war and the use of chemical weapons back in the 80s. The media's portrayal of the cyber threat and the rhetoric and the language that's used by political leaders can make a difference. But I think fundamentally, sadly, it's some kind of evidence of the effects of the cyber.
Yeah, and I would add too, I think, unfortunately, and this is the point we were trying to make with the confusing lexicon that's out there for cyber right now. There's such a, many argue, Thomas Reid and others, sort of threat inflation. We're conflating all these things together, and I think to have the stigma emerge and have a perception develop that would support things, maybe things like some of these economic incentives, I think that needs to be cleaned up, because right now it's so easy for the consumer, the average consumer, someone to see, yeah, cyber warfare is terrible, there's all this bad stuff going on, but really it's kind of the constant ebb and flow. But if it's more delineated and catastrophic in a credible way, that might have a better effect.
I think just one final point, adding on to the point that we had there at the beginning about leadership. I think leadership is very important, and really in order for there to be some form of international leadership, it has to be seen in the national interest to do something about the threat. So I think it's that as well. But international leadership can make a difference by fueling the language, fueling the awareness of potential threats and dangers. And stigma, I'm sorry to carry on, but stigma is all about labeling. And so if you can label something and identify something as a threat, then you can do something about it. So the two go hand in hand. It needs leadership, and there needs to be some tangible labeling of the stigma threat, which we say in our slides. The problem with that is that is diffuse, secretive. What is classed as a cyber threat attack?
Incidentally, we just did witness one of the largest distributed denial service a few days ago. And the attackers were exploiting a botnet of vulnerable devices that were not deployed within corporate networks, were simply present in our houses, in our living place. So who is responsible for those devices? The devices that are obsolete within a 6-month period are never patched and are never connected. It's my guess, it's my educated guess that the producer of those devices needs to be made liable for the defects and flaws they introduce during the product development life cycle. We cannot expect our family members to be liable for that.
But if we make them liable, how are we going to deal with Fortune 500 list and then let it go stand?
We're going to face some shocks, but it's the price we need to pay for more security.
Okay, talking about stigmas and the other topic about ethics. We've seen the last couple of weeks a few presidential debates, and I think some ethics and the dilemmas were at stake over there. So what about leadership, our future leadership, which also is responsible for cyber warfare? How do you see, what's your point of view for the example of leadership in ethics and stigmas?
Well, I think that, so do you mean how do I see I'm not sure of your question. How do I see the future leadership within the states or in general?
Within the states or in the national way, but it was just an example, what we saw the last couple of weeks, how they present themselves, which means they use to achieve their political objectives, try to. So how can we see that as an example, and how, from your point of view, prevent that kind of issues?
I mean, I would say leadership, as Patricia said earlier, more generally is so important to push a norm out there. I think the danger that we're in now, and it's illustrated, I think you're referring to the DNC hack and some of those things, it's unclear what the U.S. response will be, right? There will be one, but there's the danger of escalation that can actually be counterproductive to developing a norm at this point. And I think some actors out there, there's actually that may be in fact their interest. And then of course you have the media leaks over the past few years of purported U.S. activity that I think has also created barriers and eroded trust and cooperation among international leaders to maybe push something. I think that there was real pressure on the Chinese after the APT1 report came out, and we may have really had a different outcome than we had, but then there was the media leaks, Snowden leaks, and that I think immediately eroded the credibility that the leadership had in the U.S. to push some of these things. And certainly the dynamic now with Russia and the DNC hacks, I think, further complicates that messy web.
I think also though that it's not in a vacuum. If we're looking at leadership, it cannot be one state that just takes responsibility. It has to be a collective. So the leadership is really in the sense that if we're looking at powerful states, it's how those powerful states act as enablers as entrepreneurs, a little bit like I rushed through it a bit, but the slide about the norm life cycle, it's how leaders harness and encourage the international community to address sort of a particular threat and to take some kind of action. So the leadership role is to take forward and sort of try and form some kind of collective agreement, some collective action to address that threat, but it cannot only be one state that does it. And I think in some ways with the debates and the responses, they're reactionary and they're used for political objectives. but it needs to be a broad picture. It cannot just be one thing. It needs to be sort of media, the business working together, legislature. It has to be everything together, and the role of the leadership, the states as leaders, is to encourage and fuel that. But essentially it has to be and this is where we say that you need the stigma, you need the labeling in order to harness the threat and address the threat. And it's how do we encourage that labeling? How do we, what measures can be taken to do that?
I'd like to consider the possibility to do a step back. Being a person coming from the private sector, when we speak about conflicts in general, the private sector is not part of the conflict usually. But when we speak about cyber conflicts, the private sector is always involved. Sometimes the private sector is the target of a computer network operation. Some other times, a computer network operation may go through the networks of a private sector actor. So I'm mostly concerned about the leadership that can be contributed by members, a representative of the private sector. In general, when we speak about technology, both defensive and offensive technology, what I can say that the pace of innovation of the technology was faster than our practice in terms of governance and self-governance. This is why I try to set forth some principles, standards in terms of a code of business ethics that I offer not only to my own business, but to the private sector itself in order to improve upon that. I don't believe I'm providing with that a definitive answer. It's just a first step, and I will come more iteration and contribution by other members of the industry.
I think that the stigmatization of what you call cyber warfare, I think the point that you were trying to make is that it's not just warfare conducted through cybernetic or electronic means that delivers an effect on a particular target. As a broad category, we should never operate through cyber means or like air means or land means. But you have an existing legal and normative structure already in place with the law of armed conflict and international humanitarian law that says that it is impermissible, there's no military necessity, to utilize through cybernetic means a device or something that would have an impact upon the civilian population that would be harmful to them. So it would be unlawful under existing law of armed conflict and international humanitarian law to utilize through cyber means a weapon or a piece of code that will shut off power at a civilian hospital. And so if you scale things back simply, and I try to do that to explain to people simply what they're trying to do or how this warfare works, how do you think it's going to be possible to achieve the greater sense of stigmatization that comes from conflating this into a fear issue, when really what you need to do to create the stigma is to explain in granular detail that there are certain ways of conducting military operations through cyberspace that are bad, like firebombing civilian populations or taking out civilian grids. That's what you really want to prohibit, not feed into, oh, everything cyber is terrible, the world's going to collapse and we're going to fall apart. That's not really what we see with attacks and their outcomes that have been utilized so far.
And I would say, first of all, I think that is the point we're trying to make too, that you need to have that precision and that level of discussion. I do think on the point of the application of the laws of armed conflict, the cyberspace, that there is a emerging consensus of that, but it's not yet achieved the same effect in practice that I think it does for other types of armed conflict. And I mean, to use the example you just mentioned in terms of damaging critical infrastructure, and we saw in Ukraine that certainly didn't deter the Russians from doing what they did to the Ukrainian power grid. So I think there's more work to be done, but we're in agreement, I would say, with your point.
Before I ask, we got 2 questions more. I can have a last third question, so if somebody would like to run it, feel free.
Hi, Steve Gundari from Novus. Somebody mentioned earlier that there's a distinction between the military application and the civilian application in terms of attacking and response. And I think the question that was raised here just a second ago sort of stepped into that and pointed out that really that's sort of blurred. And I would point out that this issue of the United States making a response to Russia in response to the DNC hack is a great example, because the DNC is not part of the United States government. So the fact that they were hacked or attacked is really a sort of commercial process if you look at it in a definitive way. It wasn't attacking U.S. forces or a U.S. government facility per se, yet we are publicly talking about responding to Russia through the U.S. government. So it seems to me, just using that example, that this process is blurred. This distinction between civilian versus military conflict is already, obviously without it being defined, that's what everybody's saying here, we're still trying to define it, it's already occurring. So I'd ask a comment on that.
I think you're right. I think that links in with our point about the challenge. I mean, the stigma, at present, you have one category of warfare that is stigmatized. Cyber is not stigmatized, and we're looking at how to try to foster cyber norms, how to foster that. But the challenge that we have is that distinction. It's blurred, as you say. So I think I would say, and again, I'm seeing this from the academic perspective, from the theoretical perspective, in the sense that you need to harness awareness of the threat, and there needs to be some collective action and some form of leadership to drive momentum to label that threat as something as distinct. So it's a long-term, it's a long-term process, which I think is just going to require a continuous effort. And the problem we have is that the threat is diffuse and needs to be, I think, addressed more specifically.
And I would say, yeah, and I would say, to Alfonso's point, I mean, it is uniquely, I think, raises the public-private dimension that complicates things. And then also, and this is where, again, I think the WMD analogy is applicable, it raises some of the offense-defense questions. So with bio, it's a very fine line between an offensive BW program and a defensive bio program, and the same is true with cyber, where I think you can have certain capabilities that are defensive in nature, but anyone could argue that they're also offensive. So it's intent, that complicates it.
So yes. Mike? Is the mic on?
Ed Sovias from the Army Cyber Institute. I apologize, but I just gotta throw out something that I'd like you to maybe think about is sometimes I feel like we're trying too hard to focus on norms, stigma, ethics, and maybe one should think more about incentives. I think when it comes to kind of raw power and this sort of anarchy that is developing with the Internet of Things, I'm almost reminded of natural selection. And I think in many respects, I think we need to, rather than necessarily an ethical foundation, explore the incentive space and think about, in terms of the way we evolved as a race with natural selection, how do we then evolve as a virtual race? And as much as we'd like to do the right things, I think that we can't count on people to do that. There was just too many caveats as you described all the things that need to go right. So just something to think about, the concept of natural selection.
And I guess I would just say on that too, I mean, that's a great point, thank you. And definitely something to ponder, but in terms of norm evolution theory, we kind of glossed over very quickly. I think it in fact, again, norm evolution theory draws some of those same threads, and the central hypothesis that a state's collective perception of its self-interest is what will drive it to push for a norm is precisely that. So I think there's a convergence there.
We have time for one more quick question.
I don't know whether this is necessarily a question, but it is the fact that as you start to granularly dig down into things, that what you're really looking at is the use of force in another country's area through cyber means. And so there is a general prohibition, I think, in international law of tampering and interfering with the political process and sovereignty of another country, which is where the DNC issue comes in. But it made me think while you were talking that really what we are discussing is the civilian infrastructure versus military infrastructure, civilian targets versus military targets. But with the use of civilian Internet of Things, with civilian devices and this stuff, where do you think it comes in that we have to place the obligation on the civilians to protect and keep their devices, their homes, their things from being used by an enemy to conduct attacks? We don't do that in the kinetic realm of saying, hospitals need to have, armed guards around them to protect theirs. No, they're given certain protections by law that they're not legitimate targets. How do you see in cyberspace, in warfare conducted partially with cyber means, of putting an obligation on the civilian populace to defend themselves? They should not be attacked and targeted to begin with.
I don't see, in a realistic sense, the opportunity, the possibility to compel private citizens to protect their devices, because market forces are in place that suggest to extend attack surface, and perverse incentives such as configuration provide them the ability, provide to software manufacturers the ability to dump the liability onto the consumers. They really can't keep up with all of that. So while it would be possible to consider anything like this in the context of industry and corporates, I don't see the possibility that my mother, which is to say, can make it.
So as a roundup, we always are so negative in cybersecurity. So I just want to give you 30 seconds to show me how the Shangri-La of this sounds. Like how if everything was perfect, and we have this place where it's the perfect and everything works the way you want it. How would that sound in 30 minutes? How do you see the perfect world in your world? Very quick, 30 seconds. You got it.
I think from the normative perspective, it would be some of those things we recommended: clarity in language and terms, and the bifurcation of the spectrum of cyber threats with associated public perception and leadership perception of certain elements of that as unacceptable and off the table. And that would ultimately be codified in potentially agreements and treaties, which have all kinds of other verification issues that we could delve into.
I would see a perfect world as a world where consumers have the ability to tell good security products apart from bad ones, where information asymmetries are finally resolved, where a vulnerability researcher has effective means to monetize on their talents and effort and skills, where it's possible to hedge against the information security risks we are exposed to using financial instruments that are being designed around vulnerability information.
That sounds very nice.
I think Brian's more or less said what I think. I'd like to see an ideal world where everyone works together and there's international law that prohibits the use of certain weapons, and states choose not to use and actors choose not to use those weapons. So it's never going to happen. That's what I'd like to see.
Hope is the last thing. So thank you so much, and this will conclude our session, and I invite you to for a constant